You brought up the Atlantic Council. Who else, is particularly beholden to these foreign interests?
Really, most major think tanks here in Washington. I mean, just to rapid fire some, there's the Brookings Institution. They have historically taken a lot of funding from Qatar. There was a big scandal a few years ago where their president, John Allen, was indicted under FARA for allegedly lobbying for Qatar. Now, those charges were eventually dropped, but the indictment alleged like he was giving advice to the Qataris on how to deal with the Biden administration, all these things. So there's the Brookings Institution. There is Center for Strategic International Studies. There's Middle East Institute. That's one that really is heavily funded by Gulf interests, especially the United Arab Emirates. Stimson Center also takes a fair share of foreign funding, German Marshall Fund. So really down the line, like it's actually at a certain point harder to find a think tank that is not funded by a foreign government or a defense contractor.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. As I'm sure you can see, I'm going to be your host here moving forward as my erstwhile co-founder and co-host at American Moment has gone to serve President Trump in the administration. But not to worry, we will still have a steady stream of content ready for your eyes and ears in the coming weeks ahead. Wanted to flag a couple exciting things we have going on at American Moment. I will say that the application for the Summer Fellowship for American Statecraft is currently live. We are going to have those applications open till the end of the month. So if you're looking to get your career started here in DC, want to get paid for your first internship, please go ahead and apply on our website. It's americanmoment.org/fellowship. And you're not left out. If you're already here, please do come and join us at AM Fridays, which is our summer intern training program. We have lunch every week. It's Chick-fil-A all the time. All chicken all the time. But you can come and join us in the Senate. You can fill out a form for that at americanmoment.org/AM Fridays. And now we're going to talk a little bit about this exciting episode we have today. We brought on Nick Cleveland-Stout, who is currently with the Quincy Institute, and we talked about all of the foreign governments and defense contractors giving money to think tanks here in D.C. To push their priorities. I feel like I need to take a shower after everything I just learned. It's so slimy and disgusting. But Nick is a junior research fellow in the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Previously, he conducted research on U.S.-Brazil relations as a 2023 Fulbright Fellow at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, with a particular focus on the influence of American think tanks in Brazil. He's a former Marcellus Policy Fellow with the John Quincy Adams Society, whose president, John Allen Gay, we've had on this podcast before, where he authored The Case for a Green BRAC. His work has appeared in Responsible Statecraft, The Nation, The Intercept, The Brazilian Report, Inkstick, and The National Interest. Nick earned his bachelor's degree from Colorado College, where he studied political science. It was a great interview. It's not very often that we have left-wingers here on the podcast, but it was a very interesting discussion about, the ways that foreign governments and defense contractors have their fingers in everything policy related here in D.C. We also talk about how it's probably likely that there is spies at think tanks near you. So very engaging discussion. I think you guys will really enjoy it. Let's go now to Nick Cleveland-Stout. Nick, thank you very much for coming on the pod.
Of course, glad to be here.
So as viewers of this show will know, we always start off the podcast with hearing a little bit about our guest's background, how they got where they are today. Your path may look differently than many others, seeing as you are a member of the left, which we will make sure to mercilessly bully you for. But tell us a little bit about how you got where you are involved with the Quincy Institute and everything you're up to now.
All right, I can already tell this is going to be a recurring theme of the podcast, going to be bullied here and there, and I welcome it. But yeah, so I got interested in foreign policy when I was going to school in Colorado College, and got involved with like the John Quincy Adams Society. Was very skeptical, I think, of U.S. militarism, kind of the path that we had been on. You know, like if you're my age or around my age, like you've been at war your entire life, and so I think out of that you have a certain skepticism of hearing this line of liberal internationalism and intervention left and right. And so I just sort of naturally gravitated towards voices that were criticizing this policy. And I especially landed, I grew interested in the role of money in foreign policy and these kinds of like conflicts of interest that like once you start looking, they're kind of everywhere. Like you can't help but see them. And so I found the work of my current boss, Ben Freeman, others like him, Eli Clifton at the Quincy Institute, and just got really interested in trying to uncover kind of the role that money, lobbying, think tank funding, all of these things, the role that they play in militarizing our foreign policy. And so ultimately, after a brief detour where I lived in Brazil for a year, I ended up working at the Quincy Institute.
And who is it that you were listening to originally, like when you were in college, that the way that we on the right normally put this question is like, who radicalized you?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's totally acceptable to say Glenn Greenwald. I won't make fun of you. It's fine.
Honestly, it was probably my professor. Shout out David Hendrickson. He was also briefly the president of the John Quincy Adams Society, I think. But he wrote a series of books that just got me really interested in foreign policy and just questioning assumptions that we hear where we're inundated in on the daily, growing up about, invading country X or whatever. He just brought a very, I think, refreshing light to foreign policy that I really couldn't get anywhere else. And it was great. Like his class was, he's sort of part of that like old guard of professors that was very willing to like take students under his wing. So we had class like in his backyard and stuff. You get to know him pretty well. And so, shout out David Hendrickson for that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you first came across my radar a few weeks ago. Politico covered this think tank funding tracker, this project that you've been working on with the Quincy Institute. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it?
Yeah, so the think tank funding tracker, this is a project that has been in the works for about a year at this point. And we basically wanted to, you hear about all these special interests that influence our foreign policy, but we wanted to actually kind of like assign a number to it and create a tool that would be useful for, people like you and me or good faith journalists to be able to go to this database and kind of search these potential conflicts of interest for themselves. Think tanks, they present themselves as these very objective, kind of academic, almost research institutions. Like a lot of them even have .edu addresses. But in reality, like they are in many ways vehicles for special interests. And so we wanted to track these transactions. And so we looked at three different categories. We looked at U.S. government funding, we looked at foreign government funding, and we looked at defense company funding of the top 50 foreign policy think tanks. And I can tell you, by the numbers, kind of what we found $110 million coming from foreign governments to these think tanks that we tracked. We found $35 million coming from defense companies, weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, like RTX, to these think tanks. And we found $1.5 billion with a B coming from the US government to these think tanks. And I should say the majority of that goes to RAND, which is sort of like the Department of Defense's personal think tank, basically. But it's a lot of dough.
Yeah, that's very interesting. How do you go about finding this information? I mean, my guess is the first place I would start if it were me would be, most of the nonprofits in DC have to file what's called a 990. So are you going through and looking through their disclosures and seeing, if they maybe slipped up and listed some of these things, or how do you find this stuff out?
This is all in their annual reports, and it's all self-reported information. So it's totally voluntary financial disclosures. Like crucially, while all nonprofits do have to fill out a 990, they don't have to list the funding information of like which specific sources their funding comes from. Like they might say, X amount came from investment, X amount came from grants, X amount came from contributions, but like there's no actual breakdown in the IRS forms to where that money is coming from. However, there is some norm of think tanks, at least some think tanks, disclosing a degree of information about their funding. And all of that is just on their websites, usually updated about once a year. It's oftentimes hidden kind of like at the bottom of their annual report, or like there's plenty of ways in which they can kind of hide that information. But at the very least, it's there. And we wanted to, so we would just go through these annual reports and basically parse out like, okay, the United Kingdom is donating X amount, the UAE donated X amount in 2022, and then you record that to the tracker and slowly but surely just build out this website. And we'll be updating it at least once a year, maybe twice a year, with new information as these annual reports come out.
Yeah, one thing that I'm picking up on here is that it does not seem to be a requirement under FARA that you have to, expose when you've been funded by a foreign government. So walk us through, what requirements, if any, there are if you're going to, receive a bunch of money from a foreign government to basically be the paid opposition.
Yeah. So the Foreign Agents Registration Act is, as you know, like it's a transparency statute for foreign lobbyists to disclose certain information about, who they're lobbying for, what exactly they're doing, how much money they're giving to campaigns, all this information, one pagers that they'll hand out on the Hill. And they have to file all that information with the Department of Justice. However, think tanks, they sort of classify, at least right now, as the FARA unit is interpreting it, they classify for this academic exemption. I think the exact term is like bona fide scholastic activities. And it's an exemption that basically means that they don't have to disclose, they don't have to register under FARA, they don't have to disclose a dime, they can retain their 501c3 status, get tax breaks from the government. So not only do they have to not have to disclose this information, like they're rewarded for it, right? They get tax breaks. And there are some instances in which we've seen think tanks kind of fly a little bit too close to the sun. So it's not to say that they always classify for this academic exemption. Like there was this case of Sumi Terry last year. She's this person who worked at several prestigious think tanks, Council on Foreign Relations, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Wilson Center. And it turns out she was feeding non-public information to Korean intelligence officials, and in exchange for luxury goods, funding for her program. And so the FBI in that case took it upon themselves to say, this is a bridge too far. And so it appears as though like there is a point at which it becomes too far and it enters into FARA territory. But by and large, that's not what's happening. Like that is the exception to the rule. Like think tanks really operate in kind of the Wild West, where they're able to more or less get away with whatever they can. And right now, FARA is something of a fig leaf.
Yeah. It strikes me that, this is something actually where many on the right and left could agree that this is like probably bad. I mean, the big, thing on the right has been all of these Confucius Institutes, right, mm-hmm. at American universities, which is obviously something that we don't want to support. And then, for people on the left who are in some cases, not all, but sort of institutionally skeptical of the influence, particularly of like defense manufacturers in the United States. I mean, it seems like something that we could agree on. What's your take about what should be done to ensure more transparency and or maybe prohibit this practice entirely? Like, I don't know, you tell me.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, step one is just getting the information out there. Like that's, I think, where the stage that we're at right now. Aside from what we found in the database, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in what can be called dark money think tanks that don't disclose anything about their funding sources. And I think that is step one is think tanks need to lay their cards on the table. So, the media, the public can kind of call balls and strikes as they see them. Because we don't even have that. I mean, like that $35 million from defense contractors to think tanks, that's what we know. And to paraphrase the late, not so great Donald Rumsfeld, there's also a lot of known unknowns, right? And so I think first and foremost, we hope that this database encourages journalists to do a better job of disclosing these sorts of conflicts of interest when they, quote think tank experts in stories, when they interview them on TV, because that is important information. If you're interviewing somebody who's receiving funding from Lockheed Martin and you ask them about, should we send F-16s to Ukraine? Like that's information that people might want to know. Same with, if you're receiving Emirati funding and you're asking them about Gulf policy, that's something that people should know about. And so I think that we hope that this database starts a conversation, gets the ball rolling where there is more of a culture of transparency around that. I think if all else fails, I do think that, Congress should step in, or, we should consider other alternatives to regulation for transparency. Because at the end of the day, that's sort of what the main thing of what we're asking for. FARA is a transparency statute, and we could do something similar for the nonprofit sector.
Interesting. So let's talk about the biggest offenders. And I'm a purist when it comes to disclosing foreign funding. So right and left, please tell me who is accepting the most foreign dollars.
So that would be the Atlantic Council. They come out on
that
top.
That checks out.
Yeah, that might not surprise too many of your listeners, but the Atlantic Council, it's this massive kind of Atlanticist, given the name, not surprising, think tank, from founded, I think, in the middle of not too long after World War II. But, kind of moving away from the name, that you'd think that they'd just be focused on US European alliances. Like they also take a lot of funding from Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, I believe Taiwan, Japan, all kinds of different countries. And fortunately for our purposes, they are quite transparent. So you can kind of go in, see who they're funding. But oftentimes, when they are writing about some of these issues, like they won't disclose that they are receiving this kind of funding. Like one thing that I was tracking is they had this big report on Iran a few months ago. And they actually came out pretty in favor of a security guarantee with Saudi Arabia, which it's worth pausing and just thinking about how wild of an idea that is. From what we've seen from the reporting, that could be sending US troops to defend Saudi Arabia, a country that has been a pretty destabilizing actor, got involved in a horrible war in Yemen, all these things. If it were to be attacked by Iran or another adversary. And so, it's worth debating that bad idea, but it's also worth pointing out that there are plenty of conflicts of interest there. It received, I think, $200,000 from Saudi Arabia in 2024.
That checks out.
And it's hardly talked about. It's not disclosed by the donors. And when members of the media will quote this author, they probably won't mention this conflict of interest either. So we just want that to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. How much do you think it is the case that it's a lot of these foreign governments are giving money to people who are already espousing what they believe versus give me money and I will say whatever you want?
I think it's largely the former. Like I think largely what it does is it gives a massive megaphone to these people. Like there might be, like there are people out there. I love the U.S. There are people out there in this country who have all kinds of different views. You can pluck someone off the street, give them a megaphone, and like
they'll say some crazy stuff.
They'll say something, exactly. And like if you have an annual revenue of $100 million, and part of that money is coming from sources that clearly have their own interests in donating to you, like you're going to find people that are aligned with that viewpoint, because you also run the risk. This is just sort of how it works in the nonprofit world. Like you run the risk of losing that donor the next year if they don't see a sufficient return on investment. Now they usually do. That almost never happens. That a donor would of that magnitude, especially if it's like an oil-rich Gulf country, that they would like be that concerned about a couple million here and there. Because they're getting their influence at the margins. And the fact that they continue donating, I think, is the best proof that this strategy is working, and that they are, at least internally, seeing that return on investment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, thinking about the Saudi Arabia case in particular, like $200,000 to get them to recommend that you get a security guarantee is like, strikes me as a deal. That's like a fire sale.
It is.
Who else? You brought up the Atlantic Council. Who else? Is particularly beholden to these foreign interests.
Really, most major think tanks here in Washington. I mean, just to rapid fire some. There's the Brookings Institution. They have historically taken a lot of funding from Qatar. There was a big scandal a few years ago where their president, John Allen, was indicted under FARA for allegedly lobbying for Qatar. Now, those charges were eventually dropped, but the indictment alleged like he was giving advice to the Qataris on how to deal with the Biden administration, all these things. So there's the Brookings Institution. There is Center for Strategic and International Studies. There's Middle East Institute. That's one that really is heavily funded by Gulf interests, especially the United Arab Emirates. Stimson Center also takes a fair share of foreign funding, German Marshall Fund. So really down the line, like it's actually at a certain point harder to find a think tank that is not funded by a foreign government or a defense contractor.
And who do you think is the the most malicious actor in terms of like a foreign government? Like who's doing this the most?
I'll go with the United Arab Emirates. They I think we know the most about what they're doing, and they came out as our top donor government in our database. I think it was over $16 million in the last 5 years, and that's a very conservative estimate. That's just
people who are self-reporting.
That's just people who are self-reporting. So the real number could be much, much higher, right? And we also know more details, I think, about what the details of these sorts of agreements were with think tanks. Like there was a tranche of emails that was leaked a few years ago. Several outlets reported on these emails, and they showed that like the UAE, the Emirati ambassador Yusuf Al-Otaiba, he was actually given access in some cases to reports that think tanks were drafting. Like there was one at the Atlantic Council, again, don't mean to pick on them too much, but like they
deserve it.
they had this report that they were working on about Iran, and the author of the report sent it to Otaiba to provide feedback on. And some of those suggestions were incorporated by the author, and that sort of direct pay-to-play arrangement is deeply concerning. And we don't know, it seems like that was pretty widespread, that the UAE, at least then when we got this tranche of emails, like had agreements with these think tanks of like, not only are we going to give you this money, but there are some strings attached to this. And we want to be able to have some leverage over what the research product is going to say.
And what is it that, to take this as a case study, what is it that the Emiratis want? Like, what do they want from America that makes them so motivated to give all this money to foreign think tanks?
I mean, the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. The U.S. The U.S. has been very involved in the Middle East in the last 50 years, for better or for worse. I would say for worse. But the UAE, it's a partner of the U.S. It's seeking things like arms sales. It's seeking trying to improve its reputation. It might be looking for investment opportunities, all kinds of different things. Security guarantee. That's certainly one. Like we heard rumors about the UAE being involved in some sort of security architecture, regional air defense architecture as well. So there's all kinds of things that the UAE might be donating for. And I think one of the big reasons why they see think tanks as one such avenue for influence, because they also certainly have their own formal lobbying operation. I mean, the UAE spends millions and millions and millions of dollars a year under FARA. But the reason that I think they see think tanks as a very important alternative avenue for this influence is precisely because of this perception that persists that think tanks are these academic, objective research organizations.
Right. It's more subterfuge to get their ideas across the finish line. That's interesting. You brought up this Sumi Terry, who is accused of spying for South Korea. Is it your impression that this is? It's certainly not mine, but is it your impression that this is just like a weird quirk? Like this isn't happening that often. Like this just happened to be the case with this one person, or do you think that potentially it could be everywhere across these think tanks in Washington?
I think it's very likely that there are many similar cases. And in fact, like the answer to your question, I think like the reaction from the think tank world can tell you. Like there were people that when they heard about this indictment, their reaction was, like, so what? They sort of shrug their shoulders.
Yeah, we all do this, actually.
Yeah, they're like, oh, wait, we're being indicted for this now? And, this guy, Greg Craig, who himself faced this long-standing fight with FARA for many years for his lobbying for Ukrainian interests. Like he wrote a piece that was just like defending Sumi Terry and basically saying that if you are in the think tank world, this is in a sense his argument. Like if you are in the think tank world, you are at this kind of intersection. Like you are not in the media, you are not in academia, you are not in government, and you are not in advocacy, but you're at the intersection of all these things. And to be able to navigate in that world successly, like it requires certain entanglements.
So what I'm hearing is I can be bought off, please. Basically,
yeah. And so we just really like there are probably several other cases like this. It's concerning that the reaction from the think tank world was to just shrug. We'll see what happens. I think that this is going to be a little bit of a litmus test for whether the FARA unit wants to go after these sorts of entanglements more or not. I think largely dependent on how this case goes. Like I will say, a lot of legal experts have said, it might be a weaker case than some others. Like we saw the John Allen case was dropped, for example. So there is certainly like a reluctance to go after the think tank world, and we'll see what comes of it. But I do think that it's concerning that like the reaction is just, oh yeah, foreign entanglements. That's what we do. That's our business. That's the name of the game.
Yeah. Well, and another interesting piece of the reaction that I saw was South Korea is an ally. Like.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Exactly.
And I think that can be, they're going to try to justify it that way, like pretty far past like South Korea. It'll be a lot of these, monarchies in the Middle East per se, or they're an ally. Don't worry about it.
But it's like at the same time, like foreign governments, like by definition, do not have the same interests as the U.S., right? Like however you define whatever the U.S. national interests are, like they're going to be different from South Korea's, they're going to be different from Taiwan's, they're going to be different from Saudi Arabia's. And so that's just kind of missing from the conversation.
Yeah. I think the thing that we're not doing enough is we're not beating up on our defense contractors. So let's do that.
I would agree. We're never doing that enough.
Yeah. What is, you're talking about, what did you say? It was like 35 million or something like that. It seems like a much smaller number than foreign governments, which is terrifying. But what are their, what are they hoping to achieve with that kind of money? And does it seem to, do the organizations that they give to seem to overlap with, the organizations that foreign governments are funding as well?
Yeah. I mean, just to answer your last question, it's a resounding yes. And there's a clear reason for that as well. Like you were asking about what the UAE wants. Well, guess what? What the UAE wants largely dovetails with what Lockheed Martin wants and
more
RTX.
Weapons.
Right. More weapons, more hardware. Getting the, like, war is their business. So if we bring more countries under our security umbrella or paying for defense of other countries, and they get attacked or we get into this, great power competition and kind of security dilemma where we need to defense build up, like that's a windfall for those defense companies, right?
Yeah.
And so that's largely what they want is government carve outs, is like Lockheed Martin, for example. It's the money that I got from the Department of Defense last year is larger than the State Department's entire budget. And so that gives you kind of a sense of like they're very, very heavily reliant on the Department of Defense for their profits to deliver to shareholders. Where business is booming. There's tension in the Middle East. There's tension in Southeast Asia, like all these things. And they largely give money to think tanks with this influence in mind. Like one thing that I was tracking is what think tanks were putting out with the new Trump administration. And I noticed a lot of think tanks were putting out their own kind of versions of, like, mini versions of Project 2025, where they are explicitly looking at defense policy and, saying, and sort of like co-opting in a way Trump's vision, in which they are saying, like, this is how we need to define peace through strength. And it just sort of so happens to
here's
align
how we invade Iran. Actually, let's change the title. Exactly.
Yeah. Scrub the title. We'll give it to the ambassador of the UAE to maybe come up with a new title.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the name of the game. Like again, I'm beating up on the Atlantic Council, but like they came out with this report that was saying we need to pass a new arms package to Ukraine immediately. The American Enterprise Institute did the same thing. F-16s, attack guns, all kinds of hardware that is made by their donors. And that is just missing from the analysis, any disclosure of that conflict of interest.
Yeah, it seems to me that, like, traditionally it's the left has been thought of as sort of the critic of, a lot of these defense contractors. It seems to me, being on the right, that is sort of flipped over the last couple of years, mainly as a result of opposition to funding of the war in Ukraine. Yeah. So where really does, like, the left go from here? Like, it is a massive contributor to like the War Caucus, the pro-war party, and there are plenty of Republicans that are too. But where do we go from here in terms of, like, looking at the influence that these defense contractors have if the left is no longer going to do it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And we're already kind of seeing, like, there's just this reflexive reaction to, like, oh, okay, Trump is going to take the anti-war path.
60 billion to Ukraine immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to slam the button.
Exactly. There's a button right in front of them. Another billion here, another billion there.
Yeah.
So they are in dire straits. Like, I don't think that there's any.
You should become a right winger. If foreign policy is your big issue, man, we're the place.
Hey, you got to hold out hope. Maybe not for the Democratic Party, but we'll see. I think it's a bad bet if you're holding your breath for the Democratic Party to reform itself and taking a lot of these things seriously, quite frankly. But I think that criticism, it still exists on the left. It's there in some corners. I don't want to say that it's not, but I think by and large, the Democratic Party just has such a reflexive reaction to everything anti-Trump, instead of like realizing why certain aspects, especially of his message on foreign policy, resonates with so many voters. I mean, he went to Wisconsin in last year and he said like, part of the reason we're sending so much money to Israel, for example, is because a missile costs $2 million. Like, I can't imagine the Harris campaign doing that, or like any Democratic candidate in the near future doing that. So I think that, like, I mean, my response to your question is like the left needs to do that. Like they need to get their act together, realize why this message is resonating, and make this point over and over and over, in Nevada, in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, all over the place. And
that, like, what, Trump was right?
A little bit, yeah. Or call out these, like, this boondoggle for what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump wasn't the first person to do it. He was, I think, very much to his credit, the first major figure on the right to do this in decades and decades, if not like ever. Like, it's amazing to me that right after, like you go from George Bush to Donald Trump, who says the Iraq War was a mistake and we never should have gotten into there in the first place. Yeah. We need someone to do that on the left. Like, I think, Bernie was the closest to succeeding at doing something like that. But we need someone to come along and say, like, we actually don't need to, just like go along with whatever the opposite of what Trump says is, and recognize that he is right on a lot of these issues.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, so on the left, Bernie came the closest, but like he has supported more funding to Ukraine, right? So it's like, it's effectively, at the very least in the Senate, like there's nobody. Mm-hmm. There's nobody, mm-hmm. doing that. And I think, one of the things that I think has been really an ineffective talking point, and there are a lot of people on the right that do this too, is like, we're building all these like missiles for Ukraine. We're finally doing that industrial policy you asked for. We're like getting people jobs, and it's like, oh great, to start another world war? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Like not what I was asking for. So I don't really think that that sort of messaging is going to work. And I would really like to see members of Congress, both right and left, like form opposition to this sort of influence that, defense contractors and apparently foreign governments have over the way that we make decisions about foreign policy. But while we're saying great things about Donald Trump, let's talk about USAID. So this has been, big thing that's been happening this week. Elon Musk has shown everyone once again that you can just walk into buildings and do stuff. And so basically what they're doing over there is stopping our foreign influence operation in other countries. What say you? Good, bad, thoughts?
Yeah, I think USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, this is sort of like the flip side of what we're talking about, right? Like this database looks at foreign governments who are funding organizations inside the U.S. and getting a pretty good bang for their buck in doing so. USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, these kinds of organizations are like the flip side of that coin.
But a lot more money.
But how much is the USAID budget? Have you seen?
It's like, last I saw, it was like 0.7% of our entire budget. Yeah. So much larger scale.
Yeah. I think I won't discredit all of USAID, but what I will say is this. There are a lot of organizations that are funded by USAID, NED, that do a lot of, I would argue, do a lot of good, human rights oriented organizations. However, I would just say that a lot of it is also dressed up in this very flowery language, but carries out U.S. interests. And it's like, it's funded by the U.S. government for a purpose. Like, there's always that implicit purpose if the U.S. government is involved in some degree. And I think, when you look at, for example, which projects like NED is giving money to on Cuba or on Venezuela, like they're all just sort of like, it's like this cottage industry of groups that like exist, that keep their lights on by taking NED funding with some sort of like weird, dream of overthrowing the Venezuelan or Cuban government, which maybe at one point was like a consideration in U.S. policy, but in 2025, I just don't see how that serves U.S. interests or even, the people that live there. Like, it certainly doesn't serve their interests either. And, I am more than happy to critique any number of those sorts of projects. I think there is a debate to be had where it's like, I don't think that we just go in and bulldoze the entire organization. This is just my view. But at the same time, we cannot continue doing it the way that it has. And so, at the very least, like, this has started, I think, a conversation and opened the door to reforming some of these organizations that like desperately need reform and are stuck in the middle of the Cold War because we are not there anymore. Yeah,
you talked about Venezuela and Cuba. One of the more interesting anecdotes that I saw was that one of the things that got shut down was we were funding like 20 different opposition outlets to the current Iranian government. And now they're like all losing funding. And I'm like, we were paying for 20 of them? Like, that's insane.
And like Mike Pence and Nikki Haley were probably getting like hundreds of thousands of dollars from speaking to these groups.
I'm sure. We are going to go now to the members only section. If you don't recall our members only section, you can be either a truther or a statesman, and you basically get access to this exclusive content that we put out every week, an extra 10 to 15 minutes with every guest. We're going to talk about the things that Nick is most terrified of that nobody is talking about. We're also going to talk about how people who go and testify in front of congressional hearings a lot of times end up being paid to do so. So we're going to go into the members only section now. So Nick, that's wow. Well, Nick, where can people find you, keep up with all the work that you're doing at the Quincy Institute?
You can follow me on Twitter at Nick_Cleveland-S. Cleveland's. It was a poor choice for a Twitter handle, but it's what I got. And you can follow the Quincy Institute, and please check out our funding tracker at thinktankfundingtracker.org and read our policy brief, please, if it's interesting.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the pod.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of Moment of Truth. As always, you can find out more about American Moment at AmericanMoment.org. If you'd like to apply for our summer fellowship for American Statecraft, that is AmericanMoment.org/fellowship. If you're currently an intern in DC and you'd like to join us for AM Fridays, that's AmericanMoment.org/AM Fridays. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.